I'd rather do 10 funerals than one baptism is the thought that I had during the presentation on clergy stress, in which it was suggested that the opposite should be true. Underlying my personal unease is the current reality that most requests appear to be for a naming ritual or a rite of passage celebration rather than a sacramental rite of Christian. Canadian statistics on religious affiliation have been taken every 10 years since 1871. Currently, they paint a discouraging picture of the religious landscape in Canada. In 2019, only 68% of Canadians reported having a religious affiliation, and only 23% reported having participated in a group religious activity at least once a month in the previous year. With a decline of church attendance and church affiliation in society, clergy are more frequently being asked for rituals to mark life events, birth, marriage, and death, by a society that is both unschooled and disinterested in faith practice, but nonetheless still views church as a traditional space for rites of passage. The United Church of Canada, from its inception, understood the sacrament of baptism to be about three key theologies: grace, belonging, and covenant. And we also recognize that infant baptism fulfills the anthropological imperative for a rite of passage ritual, which welcomes and integrates the new family member. These theologies are reflected in the articulation of our faith, the basis of the union, the statement of faith, a new creed, the song of faith, as well as our liturgies celebrate God's presence, and our policies, which are articulated in the Manual 2021. Traditionally, baptism is held as a sacrament of initiation into the church, predicated upon that individual's belief and intention to participate in the life and work of the local community. Currently, there is no standardized approach or articulated support for responding to a need for a rite of passage, which will offer welcome without implicating the individual in a continued relationship with the church. In this research project, I was interested in learning how UCC ministers are navigating this liminal space between the practice of Christian faith and current post-Christian culture. I used an interpretive phenomenological analysis approach to research because I was interested not only in participants' feelings, but what adaptations they may have made in response to their feelings in the context of infant baptism. I interviewed 6 active ordained ministers in Eastern Newfoundland, collecting relevant written materials such as liturgies, policies, bulletin inserts, and educational materials. Since I am also practicing ministry in the eastern region of Newfoundland, I will use the word "we" when presenting data clips. But please be aware that I am presenting the words of my participants and not my own. Perhaps, as you hear the word "we," you might feel more or less implicated in the data. Either way, I hope it helps aid your ability to enter into the experience of the participants. During the course of my research, I hope to discover something that would assist my experience of baptism, and perhaps something that might be of benefit to the wider church. 4 integrating themes: integrity, empowerment, care, and alignment emerged from the data. There were also some suggestions for making faith connections, so we'll take a brief detour to look at those as well. The first theme is integrity. Integrity can be defined in 2 ways. First, integrity can be defined as the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. And secondly, integrity can be defined as a state of being whole or undivided. The first definition really speaks to me of personal integrity, the idea that our inward convictions match our outward actions. Translated for our particular context, this means that our convictions about baptism can be reflected in our liturgical action. As clergy, We know we are experiencing a challenge to our personal integrity when we feel uncomfortable or dishonest. The second definition, the state of being whole or undivided, speaks strongly to me of corporate integrity or communal integrity. Ministers do not stand at the font alone, the space is shared. This kind of integrity implies an alignment of values and intent. We know that we are feeling a less than positive experience of corporate integrity when we feel we have imposed on others autonomy, or when we feel that we are facilitating a system of social pressure. We know that we are striving for corporate integrity when we feel that we are a member of a team that is committed to the faith journey of the other. The second theme is empowerment. Empowerment is defined as the authority or power given to someone to do something. In the case of baptism, responsibility rests with session or worship leaders who represent the congregation. Of the 6 congregations whose ministers were interviewed, 4 had an always baptized guiding principle, and 1 had a policy which permitted a service of thanksgiving as an alternative in certain circumstances. In all 5 of these cases, baptism occurred at the minister's discretion and was generally reported to session following the sacrament. Some ministers and sessions find it convenient for ministers to do baptism on session's behalf without running every name through the session itself and then report later. Another felt more conflicted about receiving responsibility for session's role in baptism. One minister empowers their session worship leaders by leading them in educational, conversational components and provides them with information, thus facilitating their decision-making process. The decision to baptize is not rubber-stamped, but prayerfully considered. In this particular case, the minister does not stand alone at the font, having made a unilateral decision, but has empowered session to stand alongside in the full expression of their role as welcoming members of the worshiping body. This last scenario depicts alignment between the minister and the empowered session fulfilling their role. The third theme I've drawn on is care. Care is defined as the provision of what is necessary for the health, welfare, maintenance, and protection of someone. In the provision of infant baptism, there are 2 expressions of care that I'd like to highlight: self-care and pastoral care. In the case of infant baptism, this pastoral care is mostly for the parents of the candidate. The task of self-care is for the minister to maintain personal integrity in the pastoral relationship. We need to find ways of honoring our own integrity and be honest about who we are and what we believe. When we find ourselves in situations where we can't be our honest selves, the result is burnout, loss of meaning, cynicism, etc. The task of pastoral care is to explore what is necessary. One participant pointed out, a true conversation allows for what people need. A parent coming in might present something. If during the course of the conversation we begin to understand the honest motivations, then we can come to an understanding of what's really needed here. During the process of exploration, why baptism and why now, we may discover that in order to align with the parent, baptism is not the appropriate response. One participant related, I have had some parents who have said, actually, I don't think I'm going to have my child baptized, and that's fine. And, you know, I commend them again for their honesty. Understanding of those motivations and what's present, I think, is so essential. So I'm not sure if I've ever done anything that the parents wanted. in the conversations, we've discovered maybe what was needed. In the case where discernment does not lead to baptism, the task of care shifts from faith formation to maintaining relational connections and supporting faith curiosity. As clergy, we are especially attuned to the spiritual well-being of those that we are in conversation with. One participant said, I recognize that the birth of a child is an opening, is a moment when they're exploring faith potentially. So it's a good chance to have an open conversation. Another participant recognizing a baptism request as an opportunity to have a discussion with folks that they're not used to having. Another, reflecting on the motivations of parents seeking baptism, said, if we can get to an understanding of what drives people, then the aha moments come. Let's take our little detour here. We want to explore a couple of examples about how ministers are making faith connections where there is familial pressure, folk stories, or a parental sense of responsibility. First, familial pressure from the couple's parents or grandparents nagging to have the baby done. But, says one participant, maybe we get to a place where maybe there was something very powerful for the grandmother. And although the grandmother is not present in the room, if the parent suddenly becomes aware of why that was important and the love that was reflected in having the child who's now the mother baptized, then you get a bit of a shift. Secondly, some couples are influenced by folk stories related to faith which are inherited from their grandparents. This admittedly may be a primarily Newfoundland challenge left over from the days when ministers baptized babies, registered their names with vital statistics, and only buried baptized people in consecrated ground. Not having a name was understood as exclusion from heaven. Current grandparents may recall their grandparents' trauma of having an unbaptized child refuse burial in consecrated ground. Of course, all we have left from this folk tradition of baptism is Nan wants the baby to have a name. A faith connection may be made by redirecting the conversation away from the folk tradition they've heard to a discussion of what names are for, and how at the font we are named beloved children of God. As one minister quipped, it's an introduction to the community, not eternal fire insurance. Finally, be attuned to the sense of responsibility that a parent must have in exploring baptism. Baptism is not just about celebration, it is also about the spiritual health of the child. Parents understand physical health, so discussing faith in terms of spiritual health may open something current and relevant for the parent. To sum this detour, one minister said, if our conversations in prep for baptism allow people to start to feel a little differently, to think a little bit differently, then we don't know where that leads, particularly if we are willing to also to be a part of those conversations of change. Let's recap. Ministers do not stand at the font alone. In infant baptism, we stand as a member of a team focused toward the spiritual development of a child. We stand with our own integrity of convictions and actions. We stand with the congregation as a whole and as represented by session, and we stand with the parent. This is the infant candidate's spiritual team. Our last theme, theme 4, is alignment. Alignment is achieved when cross-functional team members work toward the same vision, understanding their team goals, and see how their contributions connect to a wider purpose. Translated into the context of infant baptism and the people standing at the font, alignment is achieved when ministers, congregations, and parents work toward the same vision, understanding their role, and see how their contribution connects to the child's spiritual health and faith formation. Let's integrate this with the other themes that we've looked at. Alignment is achieved when ministers, acting out of their convictions, and empowered worship leaders in the congregation, and parents considering their child's spiritual health and faith formation are working toward the same vision, understanding their role, and see how their contribution connects to the child's spiritual health and faith formation. Where there is alignment, there is also corporate integrity, the state of being whole or undivided. Our alignment with the parent is challenged when we have not adequately discerned with them and discovered together why baptism, why now. We know that we are striving for alignment when we are venturing into the celebratory unknown of baptism with a sense of wonder and the expectation of a faith-filled relationship. As one participant put it, we are not service providers. Having a baptism should be different than having a massage or having physiotherapy. They're quite kind, but I'm keenly aware of it as a service. After the service is over, we might see one another, but they won't remember me, nor should they. That's not what baptism is. At the beginning of this project, I set out to get a sense of how we as ministers in the United Church of Canada are doing when it comes to requests for infant baptism by people who are not participants in our churches. My discovery is that this depends on the level of alignment that we are able to achieve in the circumstances we find ourselves in and with the tools that we have available to us. This matters because without corporate integrity that follows alignment, clergy are stressed. We feel uncomfortable. We feel impotent. We grieve. We feel irrelevant. We feel frustrated. We feel conflicted. We abdicate our role. We practice avoidance. The 4 Tasks of Practical Theology by Richard R. Osmer provide a useful framework for clergy and church leaders to make informed decisions on how to proceed in a given circumstance. Appropriate responses to requests depend on our ability to discern with couples what is going on, why is it going on, what ought to be going on, and what is the appropriate response. I suggest to you that this requires a personalized approach that takes into account the motivations and pressures of seeking parents, as well as the wider theological and community expectations. Let me be specific. When we assume baptism, we may also preempt the conversation that follows and the bridges to faith that may emerge from it. I suggest to you, based on the research, that clergy require more time, freedom, and resources to build bridges. But we are working on it. Here are some bridges that emerged from the data. First, to varying degrees, we are utilizing the aha moments inherent in motivations and pressures which build bridges to faith connections. Secondly, we are working with the liturgy we currently have, making adaptations to reflect our theologies, personalizing to give voice to the family in the congregation, and adjusting the language to some degree. More can be done to accomplish the felt need without overreaching it, to educate and to build healing bridges from trauma. And third, we are building bridges to the faith community by introducing families to the building, to our program, and to our leadership people. We are encouraging them to check out worship. We are giving gifts that are meaningful and which serve as visible links to the community in the absence of the community, such as handmade baby blankets from the prayer shawl group, handwritten letters for the baby book, and photographs in the church newsletter, welcome posts on the church's social media, and such things. More can be done to provide education and even group prep courses, which introduce couples to others at their life stage and assist the formation of community. Much more can be done in terms of follow-up. The implication of this research for the wider church is the need for the development of a wider range of liturgical choices and supporting resources in order to meet pastoral care needs such as Thanksgiving and blessing liturgies, as well as supporting resources such as separate books and certificates to validate and advertise these alternatives. Additionally, session and worship leaders need to be educated into the role so that they are empowered to support bridge building between rite of passage seekers and faith exploration. Resource support for session and worship leaders should be free and widely available to congregations. Parental discernment and education resources are essential to support alternatives to baptism and serve as a bridge from rite of passage to faith exploration. I began this presentation by recalling my deep unease with baptism. Here at the end of this process, I cannot say that this is entirely gone. Furthermore, I hope that it never is. I hope that I will always feel a sense of awe when I am invited into the work of the Holy Spirit in the development of another person's faith. I hope that I will always approach it with no small amount of trepidation, that I will always wrestle with a sense of integrity and care in these moments, that I will be driven to be more knowledgeable, more attuned, better resourced, and more prepared to build bridges which connect the kingdom of God. It is my hope that you too have discovered something in this presentation which will positively impact your practice of ministry. Thank you for taking time to listen and to support the work of the students of AST. Thank you.